there is a story from the set of The Sound of Music that almost nobody tells correctly. Most people remember the film as a warm, joyful production, a beloved classic that brought audiences to tears and filled cinemas for decades. What they don't often hear is that one of its two central stars arrived on set already convinced the whole thing was a mistake. Not just skeptical. Not just nervous. Genuinely resistant to nearly everything the film stood for. And the person who embodied everything he was resisting just happened to be standing right next to him in nearly every scene. Christopher Plummer and Julie Andrews shared one of the most memorable on-screen partnerships in the history of Hollywood musicals. But behind the cameras, the dynamic between them was far more complicated, far more human, and honestly, far more interesting than the finished film ever let on. To understand why Plummer felt the way he did about Andrews in those early days, you have to understand where he was coming from as an actor. By the time he was cast as Captain George Von Trapp, Plummer had built a reputation in classical theater that he was deeply proud of. He had trained rigorously, performed Shakespeare, and carried himself with the kind of theatrical seriousness that serious stage actors tend to protect fiercely. The world of film musicals was not a world he had much respect for, and The Sound of Music, with its singing children and sweeping alpine scenery and emotionally uncomplicated storyline, felt to him like the opposite of everything he valued artistically. He accepted the role, but he did not accept it with enthusiasm. He accepted it the way a man accepts a long commute because the destination is worth it, except in this case, he wasn't even sure the destination was worth it either. That skepticism colored his first impressions of the entire production, and Julie Andrews sat squarely at the center of his discomfort. Andrews had just finished Mary Poppins, a performance that had earned her enormous public affection and a reputation for warmth, precision, and almost effortless charm. She came to The Sound of Music as someone who genuinely believed in the material, who prepared thoroughly, and who brought a kind of cheerful professionalism to set every single day regardless of conditions. In almost every way, she was the ideal collaborator for a project like this one. She was committed, gracious, and seemingly untouched by doubt. And that, paradoxically, was exactly what got under Plummer's skin. When you already feel like you've walked into a project beneath your abilities, and the person standing beside you is radiating complete belief in that same project, it creates a particular kind of friction. It is not hatred. It is not even genuine dislike, not really. It is something closer to discomfort turned outward. Plummer did not know what to do with Andrews's enthusiasm because it reminded him of everything he was resisting. Her dedication to the tone he was privately mocking made him feel like the odd one out, which in some ways he was. He later described her as almost too composed, too in harmony with the emotional world of the film. What he meant, even if he didn't say it in exactly these words, was that her commitment made his own ambivalence impossible to ignore. The physical environment of the production didn't help matters. Filming in Austria meant dealing with unpredictable weather, long shooting days, and the particular exhaustion that comes from working on location far from home. Andrews handled these conditions by leaning further into her discipline. She was present, focused, and consistent even when the days were difficult. Plummer, on the other hand, handled the difficulty by pulling back. He spent evenings away from the rest of the cast and crew rather than building the kind of camaraderie that location shoots often produce. His marriage was going through serious strain at the time, and he was not in a place emotionally where he could simply park those problems at the door of the set each morning and be cheerful about everything. He coped through distance, and that distance extended toward Andrews as well. What is interesting, though, is that Andrews was not sailing through this period as effortlessly as her on-set demeanor suggested. Her own marriage was strained, and her husband was not present during the Austrian shoot. Despite being surrounded by a large cast and an entire film crew, she often spent her evenings alone in her hotel room after days that had demanded nearly everything from her. She was also caring for her young daughter on location, managing the logistics of motherhood alongside one of the most demanding lead roles she had ever taken on. So while Plummer saw a woman who appeared impossibly together, the reality was that Andrews was simply choosing to keep her personal difficulties separate from her professional responsibilities. That was not effortlessness. That was discipline in its most demanding form. Neither of them fully understood what the other was carrying during those early weeks. Plummer saw composure and read it as something almost artificial. Andrews saw resistance and chose not to challenge it. They were two people navigating personal difficulty in completely opposite ways, sharing scenes every day, and slowly beginning to affect each other's work in ways neither of them had anticipated. Plummer's skepticism about the project began to bleed directly into his portrayal of Von Trapp, and this is where things get genuinely fascinating from a creative standpoint. Because rather than the resistance damaging his performance, it shaped it into something far more interesting than the conventional romantic lead the role might have produced. Von Trapp, as Plummer played him, was guarded, authoritative, and emotionally remote. He was a man who had closed himself off from feeling after great loss, and there was nothing artificially warm or softened about him in the early scenes. He was difficult. He was demanding. He was real in a way that a more enthusiastic actor might have sanded away in pursuit of likability. This was not entirely planned. Plummer was not sitting in his trailer thinking through a nuanced character arc. He was simply being honest about where he was, and that honesty translated into the character in an organic way. His instinct to resist sentiment produced a Von Trapp who genuinely needed to be broken open by Maria's warmth, which made Andrews's performance more powerful in turn. The contrast between his rigidity and her openness was not manufactured by the director. It was real, and it was caught on film. Julie Andrews recognized this, even at the time. She later spoke about how Plummer's resistance to the material actually served the film by preventing it from tipping into something too sentimental to take seriously. She understood what he was doing even if he didn't always explain it, and she adjusted her own performance accordingly. Rather than softening her portrayal in response to his guarded energy, she maintained her openness and let the contrast do its work. The result was a dynamic between the two characters that felt genuinely earned, a thaw that the audience could believe in precisely because the frost was so convincing at the start. Plummer's famous remark about The Sound of Music, the one where he referred to it in unflattering terms that made clear his feelings about the material, circulated for years and became part of the mythology surrounding the film. But it is worth examining what that remark actually revealed. It was not the comment of someone who had experienced something terrible. It was the comment of someone who felt artistically out of place in a project that didn't match his self-image as a serious performer. There is a defensiveness in that kind of humor, a need to establish distance before anyone can assume you simply enjoyed something uncomplicated. Plummer had a persona to protect, and making sharp jokes about the film was one way of protecting it. What he could not fully control was what the film went on to become. The Sound of Music did not quietly fade from public consciousness. It grew. It became one of the most enduring films in the history of cinema, beloved across generations, across cultures, and across decades in a way that very few films ever manage. And as the film grew in stature, Plummer found himself repeatedly asked about it, repeatedly connected to it, and gradually forced into a reckoning with something he had tried to keep at arm's length. That reckoning changed him, at least on this subject. His public comments about the film shifted over the years from dismissive to something considerably more thoughtful. He began to acknowledge that his original reaction had been shaped by his own insecurities and expectations as much as by the material itself. He started to speak about what the film had achieved with genuine recognition, and eventually with something close to pride. That is not a simple journey for a man with Plummer's sense of artistic self. To admit that a project you once mocked turned out to matter deeply to millions of people requires a kind of honesty that not every performer manages. His reassessment of Andrews followed a similar trajectory. The irritation he had felt during filming, rooted in her seeming embodiment of everything he was resisting, gradually gave way to recognition of what she had actually been doing. He began to articulate, more clearly and more publicly over time, that Andrews had been the emotional foundation of the entire production. Without her commitment, her discipline, and her genuine belief in the material, the film would not have worked. His contribution had been to provide counterweight, to keep the story from becoming too sweet to swallow. But hers had been to make it worth watching in the first place. In their later public appearances together, the two displayed a warmth and ease that told its own story. There was humor between them, the kind that only develops between people who have spent enough time together to understand each other's rhythms. Plummer would make dry remarks and Andrews would match them with wit. They moved around each other in conversation with the comfortable confidence of two people who had long since moved past any need to impress or protect themselves from the other. Whatever tension had existed in Austria in 1964 had been replaced by something durable and affectionate. Andrews, for her part, was consistently generous in how she spoke about the experience and about Plummer specifically. She never framed the early dynamic as difficult or unpleasant. She described him as a brilliant performer who had brought something essential to the film, something she was not sure anyone else could have brought in quite the same way. That is a gracious thing to say, but it also happens to be accurate. The film needed his restraint as much as it needed her openness, and Andrews was clear-eyed enough to see that even when they were still in the middle of it. When Plummer passed away in 2021 at the age of 91, Andrews responded publicly with a statement that focused entirely on the warmth and friendship that had defined their relationship over the decades following the film. She did not revisit the complications of that first production. She spoke about the person she had come to know, the humor he carried with him, and the loss she felt at his passing. That response said more about where their relationship had arrived than any account of where it began. The full arc of their connection, from friction to friendship, from mutual wariness to genuine affection, is a more interesting story than the simplified version that tends to circulate. The version where Plummer simply disliked Andrews is too flat to be useful. The truth is that he struggled with what she represented to him during a period when he was struggling with himself. She stayed steady, he found his footing, and the space between them gradually closed. What they created together, almost despite themselves, turned out to be something people have carried with them for more than half a century. That is, when you stop and think about it, a remarkable outcome for a production that began with one of its leads privately convinced the whole thing was a waste of his talents. Sometimes the work survives the doubts of the people making it. Sometimes it does more than survive. Sometimes it becomes something that outlasts everyone involved and continues to mean something to strangers who will never know the full story of what it cost to make. The Sound of Music is that kind of film. And Christopher Plummer, whatever he felt walking onto that set in Austria all those years ago, is an inseparable part of why.